Today we're talking to Dr. David Noe, professor of classics here at Calvin University. We're talking about a book which he translated recently. So it's going to be just a casual conversation discussing the book, why he does translation work, and any other thing which may come up. The book is God or Baal, 2 Letters on the Reformation of Worship and Pastoral Service. It recently came out. So David, as we get going, tell me, why was this particular book or these particular letters chosen? Why did you even decide that something like this needed to be translated?
Right. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for having me on. I really appreciate this. So the the impetus behind these particular letters was actually a comment made by, of all persons, Richard Muller. After I had finished the Franciscus Junius volume, which was, I think, in 2015, Richard said, you know, there are 2 letters, actually 3, from very early in Calvin's career, and only one of them has ever been put into English. And he said, these are really important for the understanding of Calvin's development early on in his life as a scholar and pastor. And so based on that, I began the work several years ago and was delayed by other projects, and eventually got around to finishing it up just this last year, 2020. I'm going to adjust my screen here a little bit. There we go.
All right, very good. Thank you. So the letters were chosen. What's important about them? Okay, they hadn't been translated before, so why should they have been?
Right. So there are 2 letters actually, and then a very small prefatory letter. So the 2 letters, one is written to Nicholas Duchemin, one of Calvin's early associates, and the other is written to Gerard Roussel. And they're important because they give us an intimate look at Calvin's thought at a particular moment in time. So this was after he had published the 1536 edition of the Institutes. It was after he had begun his work in Geneva in late summer, early fall 36. So it's the first salvo, you might say, in the Nicodemite controversy. Okay. It's the first instance in which he says, if you have evangelical, what would have been described as Lutheran convictions at the time, if you have evangelical convictions, you can't just stay in the Roman Church. You can't say, well, worship is entirely interior. It's not exterior. So it doesn't really matter if I participate in Mass and so forth. I'm still, following the Lutheran ideas of justification by grace alone through faith. And Calvin said, no, that you can't do that. You have to either, to use a slang term, you have to fish or cut bait, right? You either have to side with God, right, or with Baal, in his words. So this is a reference to his quotation of Ezekiel in the tiny little letter. It's only about 2 pages. That's prefaced to these 2 larger letters, in which he says, the choice facing French evangelicals in particular is just the same choice that faced Elijah at Mount Carmel, right? If Baal is God, worship him, but if God is God, then you have to say no to that. So the first letter was actually translated, the one to Duchemin was translated by Henry Beveridge in 1852. And the second one had been translated into a couple of other European languages, but never English.
Interesting. So as you worked with these letters, was there anything in particular that surprised you about Calvin and the way in which he wrote these letters?
Right. A number of things. That his own stylistic hallmark is brevity, right? Brevitas. He says, this is what I've always aimed for. This is why my commentaries are so short, right? Compared to other commentaries on scripture. And you can see that he's really intent on this concept of brevitas throughout the letters. But another hallmark of his character and temperament, more than maybe of his style, is this concept of morositas. So morositas means a kind of touchiness or irritability, right? Calvin acknowledges quite openly that he has a bad temper. And so, the famous quote of Calvin that if I hear I'm sorry, if a man is being attacked, his dog, barks in defense. How can I not do the same thing if I see the honor of God besmirched? That's a rough paraphrase of, a famous saying of Calvin's. And so you see that temperamental irritability in these two letters, and you see him working hard to control it. But in addition, it's the most sustained attack on the Mass, the second letter, of anything I've read from the 16th century. Now, obviously, I haven't read everything, or even a tenth probably, but I've read enough to know this is some really strong and caustic polemic against the practice of the Mass. He's really upset about this, and I think it stems from a sense of personal betrayal. That these two men to whom the letters are addressed, Duchemin and Roussel, even though their names are not in the letters, we have the identity given to us by both Beza and Kaladin. And so these men had been at one point, one of them had been a close friend, Duchemin, and a contemporary, and the other, Roussel, was a mentor. So when they decide to say to Calvin, yes, you're right on all the substantive points, but we're not going to do anything, this really sets him off.
Mm-hmm.
So that was surprising.
Okay.
The intensity.
Right. As I skimmed through the book myself and reading the letters, it was interesting to get the tone that Calvin, it seemed as if with one he could be a little more harsh than the other.
Mm-hmm.
So the friendship aspect of the whole letter writing context seemed to enter into these into the book as well. So I found that there was a real personal nature to this.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he was speaking to something that was very hard and difficult, but there was also a relationship there, and so he was trying to navigate that. It seems to me it was a balance, though.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's accurate. So these aren't letters in the sense that you and I would speak about letters, right? And perhaps many of the viewers here, you think of a letter, you think of something that discusses, for the most part, everyday concerns, kind of mundane things. I mean, there might be some weighty matters presented in a letter about, the sickness of a loved one, or financial difficulties. But for the most part, letters are seen as an expression of personal sentiment. For the most part, that's not what Calvin's doing, right? These are what you would call epistolary treatises.
Right.
So it's a letter with one stated recipient, but all the time Calvin has in mind, this is for a general public. And so in the genre of epistolary treatise, which goes back to Cicero and Seneca, and of course it's in Augustine and Erasmus and men of the 16th century like Erasmus, you pick out an imagined or a real recipient, and you include some niceties and personal things, but you're really expecting it to be read by a very general audience.
Right. Okay. Yeah, excellent. Very good. Let's change the topic a little bit here. So you've done other translation work. Tell me about that type of work. Why do you like it? Yeah, is there something about it that attracts you?
Right. Well, I got into it based on opportunism, actually. Very early on, I guess it was about 2013, 2012, I was coming up for a tenure, interview here at Calvin and my institution. And although I had done work of various kinds, I didn't have one large project that I could put forward as a significant contribution that would earn me tenure. So a friend of mine, Dr. Jonathan Beakey, he said, Franciscus Junius wrote these prolegomena to theology. It's an important work. Richard Muller, also said, yes, that's a very important work. And Jonathan said, why don't you translate that? Because it would be an important contribution. And I said, all right, I need something to do. I need a 10-year level project. So I got into it, and it took me about 6 or 7 months altogether to get the first draft done. And what I found was that the long preparation in studying Latin had served me well. And so I kind of backed into the classics via Reformation interest. When I was an undergraduate, I was very interested in Calvin. I got to read the Institutes with Dale Cooper, who was the chaplain at Calvin at the time. And I noticed in Battle's McNeil edition, all of these footnotes and such that were in Greek and Latin. And this stimulated my interest to learn these languages so that I could appreciate what I was reading. And then I left those interests for about 20 years while I was trying to gain ability in Latin. And so about 2013, 2014, I find myself coming back to these interests more seriously and now having the opportunity to share them with others. So I take it as just a tremendous privilege to be able to take the thought of these men and the thoughts of these men and present them to a contemporary audience. So 100 years ago, maybe, or 150 years ago, if you were interested in Reformation studies, your Latin was already quite strong and there would be less need for what I'm doing. Now there's a great resurgence in interest in Reformation studies, but unfortunately the language ability has gone down, has gone in the other direction. So for me, this is an opportunity, and I take it like I think of the commandment against bearing false witness, right? If I'm going to present the thought of men like Calvin and Junius and Beza and Aerosmith and so forth, I have to be really, really careful that I'm being honest, because otherwise, I'm putting words in their mouth, which it is a really dishonest thing to do.
Right, exactly. Interesting point. So any words of advice for someone interested in doing this so that it's done accurately, it's done well?
Yes. Well, it takes a tremendous amount of hard work and discipline. It takes, so you need to develop those kinds of dispositions and temperaments. It requires good partnerships. So for the Junius volume, for example, Ken Bratt read the entire thing, and he made a couple dozen improvements in terms of, or more in terms of felicitous expression. He also caught a few errors, because everyone's going to make errors. So I'm very grateful for that. For the Beza book, I also had that carefully reviewed by another scholar. So in terms of holding oneself accountable, it's good to have other partners, peers. So I'm always looking for someone who's a better Latinist than I am. And of course, there are such people, right? But you have to find them and get them to agree to help you, right? And so that's really important. I think the third thing would be try to get people to evaluate you who are not sympathetic to you, right? So my degree is from the University of Iowa, and the classics department at Iowa treated me with a lot of grace and kindness, and I'm very appreciative of that. But there was no way they were going to give me a pass simply because I'm a Christian, right? Whatever my piety might be, that's not going to cut any ice with them, you might say. So my Latin was constantly evaluated by people who were not going to lower the standard. And so that peer evaluation or mentor evaluation is really indispensable. So my advice to young men and young women who want to do this is find the most difficult language environment that will accept you and stay in it for as long as you can. Because I don't think anyone is served by immature and inaccurate translations coming out onto the market. I think that's a very dangerous thing.
Very good point. Thank you. Well, as we wrap up, are there any other thoughts you have either about the book itself or translation work in general? Anything that you would want?
Sure. Well, the book it has a foreword by Bruce Gordon, who wrote, maybe the best biography, well, certainly the best one of the 21st century thus far of Calvin, which was published in 2009. And so I'm very grateful to Bruce that he contributed this foreword. It's a brilliant foreword. I'm really honored to have his name associated with this book, as well as the other scholars that provided blurbs for it. The act of translating is pretty solitary. But in order to bring a product like this to an audience, an ecclesiastical and academic audience, you have to have a lot of friends and associates who are willing to help. And so, I'm very grateful for all the people that contributed to it. And they're mentioned prominently in the acknowledgments because, it wouldn't come out without them. I'd also like to express gratitude to Reformation Heritage Books because they continue to publish, and I don't even know if it's profitable for them. They continue to publish these important works of theology in translation. And some of them, they haven't seen the light of day since the 1530s to be put out like this. That's a really important long-term contribution. And also I have a translation of a Puritan divine, John Arrowsmith, that's going to be coming out this fall, God willing, that Chad Van Dixhorn worked on. It's John Arrowsmith's Tactica Sacra, which we're either going to entitle Sacred Strategies or perhaps Holy Warfare. And this is a really charming and even witty book. Calvin's God or Baal is a frontal assault on an idea that he found extraordinarily offensive. John Arrowsmith is kind of a long walk through his library, as well as deep theological reflection. And I think readers are going to find this really engaging. Excellent. So I give a little plug for that.
Excellent. That's great. Thanks a lot. Thank you for talking to us today and giving us your insights. This has been very helpful and very useful. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate the opportunity.